Let's get started. Story number 1.
It was one of those February nights where the air felt like it was made of ice. The kind of cold that cuts right through your clothes, numbing your skin before it even has a chance to fully settle in. I was living in a small town in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan at the time, working as a night security guard at a local warehouse. The place had once been a factory, but now it sat abandoned on the outskirts of town, just beyond a stretch of woods. The warehouse was the last place most people would want to be, especially at night, and especially during winter, when the snow and ice could make even the simplest task feel like a nightmare. But the hours were good, and the pay wasn't bad, so I stuck with it. The shift I was working that night was a late one, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The wind was picking up as I made my way to the warehouse parking lot, the snow swirling in the streetlights as I pulled into a space near the back of the building. I didn't expect much excitement, just the usual rounds of walking the perimeter and checking the security cameras. The warehouse had been empty for years, so the only things I ever had to watch out for were the occasional raccoon or stray dog that would wander by. But that night was different. From the very beginning, something felt wrong. I had barely walked through the main entrance when I noticed a strange sound. It wasn't the usual creaks and groans of an old building settling. This was something more deliberate, a soft, rhythmic tapping. I stood still for a moment, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The noise was faint, but there was no mistaking it. It was coming from the upstairs office area. I knew the building well enough to know that the upstairs had been abandoned years ago. No one had been up there in a long time, but there it was. Tap, tap, tap. My mind raced. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe a pipe had burst or some animal had gotten inside, but the air felt too still for that. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the staircase that led to the second floor. As I walked up the stairs, I could hear the tapping more clearly now. It was louder, more insistent, like it was right around the corner. When I reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated. The hallway in front of me was dark, and the office doors on either side were all closed. There was no reason for anyone to be up here. No one had rented the space in years. I took a deep breath and started down the hallway. The tapping stopped as I moved closer to the first door on the left. I shined my flashlight into the crack beneath the door, but there was no movement. The room was completely dark, and there was no sign of life inside. I was about to turn away when I heard the sound again. This time it was louder and closer. I swung the door open without thinking, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating an old, dusty desk piled with papers. But there was no one in the room. Nothing was moving. The tapping had stopped completely. I stood there for a moment, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something didn't feel right. I checked the other rooms on the floor, one by one. Same story, nothing but abandoned furniture and dust. No sign of anyone. No sign of anything that could explain the noise. I walked back down the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the silence of the building. By the time I got back to the main floor, I was starting to feel foolish. I had probably just imagined it. The wind had been howling outside, and the building was old. Pipes and rafters creaked all the time. I shrugged it off and made my way to the security desk. But as I sat down, trying to calm my nerves, something caught my eye on the camera monitors. The warehouse floor, which I knew to be empty, was not as empty as it should have been. On one of the screens, I could see movement in the corner of the room, near the far wall. I froze, staring at the grainy image on the screen. It was hard to make out at first, but there was definitely something or someone moving slowly toward the back exit. A shadowy figure, draped in what looked like a heavy coat. My mind raced. It couldn't be. I had just checked the warehouse. I knew for a fact that no one was supposed to be inside. I grabbed the walkie-talkie, my hands shaking. "Is anyone else here?" I asked, my voice low but urgent. There was a crackle of static before the dispatcher came through. "No. You're the only one on shift tonight. Is everything all right?" My stomach twisted. I didn't know what to say. There was no one else in the building, and yet I could see the figure moving in the camera feed. I sat there for a moment, frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Should I go out there? Confront the person? Or call the police? I decided to play it safe and called the police, my voice tight as I explained the situation. They assured me they'd be on their way soon, but I knew it could take a while for them to get here, especially with the storm making the roads treacherous. I didn't want to wait around for that long, but I also didn't want to leave. The figure on the camera was still moving slowly, as though it was deliberately trying to stay out of view. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to investigate. I grabbed the flashlight and my heavy-duty flashlight baton, steeling myself for whatever I might find. I checked the back exit door first, but it was locked. I made my way through the maze of machinery and old pallets, keeping the flashlight beam on the floor to avoid being caught off guard. The cold was starting to creep in now, settling over my skin like a second layer of frost. The warehouse felt even emptier than it had before, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every sound was amplified, the creak of my boots on the frozen concrete, the hum of old lights overhead. Then I heard it again, the same rhythmic tapping. But this time, it wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from the far side of the warehouse, near the loading dock. I moved slowly, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the tapping was getting louder and faster, almost like a frantic rhythm. I reached the corner of the warehouse, and there, at the far end, standing under one of the broken lights, was the figure. The figure was still, its back to me. The only movement was the tapping, which was now louder than ever. It took me a moment to realize that the figure wasn't tapping with a hand or a foot. It was tapping its head against the wall, repeatedly. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt like they were made of stone. I was paralyzed, watching this person, or whatever it was, slowly banging their head against the concrete like some sort of ritualistic madness. Just as I was about to turn and run, the figure suddenly stopped. It turned toward me, but it wasn't a person. The face was pale and gaunt, the eyes wide and unblinking. It had no mouth, no nose, just two hollow black holes where a face should have been. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure raised one long, spindly arm and pointed directly at me, the tapping beginning again. Faster now, almost frantic. And then it stopped. Just like that. No more movement. No more sound. I bolted for the door, adrenaline coursing through me. I didn't stop until I was in my truck, driving back through the snowstorm as fast as I could. The entire way home, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing in the road behind me. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if it was a hallucination or something much worse. But I know this much. There was something in that warehouse, and I never went back. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The winter of February 2018 was the coldest I had ever experienced. The wind cut like a knife, and the thick blanket of snow that covered everything seemed to muffle the world into silence. I was living in a small town in upstate New York at the time, a place surrounded by dense forests and long, winding roads that stretched for miles without another soul in sight. It was the kind of town where people kept to themselves, especially in the winter months when the snow piled up so high that even the main roads became impassable for days. I had just moved into a small rental house at the edge of town. It wasn't much, a one-story cabin with an old wood-burning stove, outdated furniture, and a rickety porch that creaked whenever the wind blew too hard. The landlord had warned me about how isolated the place could get in the winter, but I had been eager for solitude. I was in the middle of writing my first novel and needed the peace and quiet. At first, everything was perfect. I would wake up to the sound of snow falling against the windows, make a cup of coffee, and settle down at my desk to write. The only downside was the occasional power outage, which was common in this area. The house had a backup generator, but even that wasn't reliable. Sometimes the power would flicker in and out for hours before finally coming back. One night, during the second week of February, the power went out completely. I wasn't too worried. I had stocked up on firewood and candles, and I figured it would be back by morning. I lit a few candles around the house and wrapped myself in a thick blanket, settling into the old armchair by the fire. The silence was comforting at first, but as the night stretched on, I began to feel uneasy. It started with a noise, a faint scratching sound, like something moving against the outside of the house. At first, I thought it was just the wind blowing a tree branch against the siding, But as I listened more closely, I realized it was coming from the back of the house, near the bedroom window. I hesitated before getting up, telling myself it was nothing. But the sound continued, slow, deliberate scratching, like someone dragging their fingernails against the glass. My stomach twisted as I stepped toward the bedroom. The air felt colder than before, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls. I reached the window and took a deep breath before pulling back the curtain. There was nothing there, just snow-covered trees stretching out into the darkness. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling ridiculous for letting my imagination get the best of me. I returned to the living room, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. I kept glancing toward the hallway, half expecting to hear the sound again. But the house was silent now, except for the occasional crackling of the fire. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the way it does when you've been alone for too long in the middle of nowhere. A few hours passed, and I finally dozed off in the chair. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up suddenly to a loud thud from the front porch. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear over the wind. It could have been snow falling from the roof, I thought. But then I heard footsteps, slow, crunching steps on the snow-covered wooden planks outside. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside the front door. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Maybe it was my landlord checking on me, but why would he be out in this weather at this hour? I stood up slowly, trying not to make a sound. I moved toward the door, peering through the peephole. At first, I didn't see anything, just darkness and the swirling snow. But then I noticed something, faint, just beyond the porch light. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the house. I couldn't make out any features, only the shape of a person wrapped in a heavy coat or cloak, their face obscured by the darkness. I took a step back from the door, my pulse racing. I didn't know what to do. Should I call someone? But the power was out, and my cell phone had barely any service in this area. I didn't even have a neighbor close enough to call for help. Then, as I stood there frozen, the figure moved. Slowly, it took a step forward, then another. I felt my stomach drop. I reached for the lock, double-checking that the door was secure. The figure stopped just at the edge of the porch, where the light from inside barely touched it. And then, it spoke. Not loudly, not in an urgent tone, but in a whisper that somehow carried through the howling wind. "Let me in." I felt ice in my veins. The voice was low, almost emotionless. I couldn't tell if it belonged to a man or a woman. It sounded strange, like it wasn't coming from the figure directly, but from all around me. I didn't answer. I didn't move. "Let me in," the voice repeated. This time it was softer, almost pleading. I turned away from the door, my mind screaming at me to do something. Anything. I grabbed the fireplace poker, my only weapon, and backed toward the hallway. The house suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in on me. The knocking started. Slow, deliberate taps on the door, not frantic or aggressive, just steady. I clutched the poker tighter, willing myself to stay calm. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. The wind howled outside, but the house was silent. I hesitated before inching back toward the peephole. I took a deep breath and looked outside. The figure was gone. The only evidence that anything had been there at all was a set of footprints in the snow, leading away from the porch and disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, my back against the wall, staring at the door until the first light of dawn finally crept over the horizon. When the power came back the next day, I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Maybe it had just been the wind playing tricks on my mind. But when I went outside later that morning, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were more footprints now. Not just leading away from the porch, but circling the entire house. Whoever or whatever had been out there that night hadn't just stood at my door. They had walked around, peering into my windows, watching me while I slept. I packed my things that same day and left the house for good. I never told my landlord why. I never told anyone. But even now, years later, on cold February nights, I still get that feeling, that overwhelming sense that something is just outside my window, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was February of 2015 when I experienced something that still sends chills down my spine every time I think about it. I was living in a small town in the north of Michigan, surrounded by woods and miles of open, barren land. The town was so small that if you blinked, you might miss it. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and any stranger was immediately noticed. I had been working as a barista at a local coffee shop for the past few months. The job was relaxing enough, but the winters in Michigan were harsh. By February, the snowstorms were frequent and the temperatures regularly dipped well below freezing. It was one of those cold February nights, just before midnight, that I found myself walking home from my shift. I didn't have a car. Living in a town where everyone knew everyone made me feel safe enough to walk most places, even when it was late. Plus, the coffee shop was only about half a mile from my house. The walk wasn't unusual. I had done it countless times before, and the crisp winter air always felt refreshing. The town was quiet, like most nights, with only the sound of the wind and the crunch of snow under my boots. It was an almost eerie silence, the kind that makes you feel like something is just a little bit off, but nothing ever happens in a town like ours. Everyone went to bed early and nothing disturbed the peace. As I walked down the road, I passed the old church on the corner. Its steeple towered above the rest of the buildings, and it had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. The place had once been a beautiful, bustling church, but after a tragic fire years ago, it had been left to rot. The windows were boarded up, and the once white paint had long since chipped away, leaving the building to stand like a shadow of what it had been. I always avoided walking too close to it after dark. Something about it made me uneasy. I would cross the street just to stay on the safer side. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I was about a block from the church when I heard a noise behind me, a faint sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. I paused, looking back. The street was empty, the glow of the street lamp casting long shadows on the snow-covered pavement. I couldn't see anyone. I frowned, but brushed it off, thinking it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon moving through the snow. I turned back to continue walking, but the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder and closer, as if whoever was behind me was trying to catch up. I turned around again, my heart pounding in my chest, and there, at the edge of the streetlight's glow, stood a man. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, with a hood pulled low over his face, obscuring his features. I couldn't see his eyes, but something about the way he stood made me feel uneasy. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and for a split second, I debated whether I should say something or just keep walking. But something told me not to make a scene. I didn't recognize him, and we were the only ones out here in this part of town. I did my best to act casual, pretending like I hadn't noticed him, and continued walking at a faster pace. But the footsteps continued behind me, growing louder and quicker as the man seemed to increase his pace. I tried not to look over my shoulder, but I could feel him getting closer. My breath quickened, my heart racing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I was scared. I didn't know who this man was or what he wanted, but there was something about his presence that made me want to run. Then, just as I reached the next street corner, I heard a voice. It was barely a whisper, but I could hear it clearly over the wind. "Hey, wait up!" The man had spoken to me. I froze. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I didn't. I kept my feet rooted to the spot, my body rigid. I didn't turn around, and I didn't say anything. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't outrun him. I couldn't fight him, and there was no one around to help. "Are you all right?" The man's voice came again, this time closer, as if he was standing right behind me. I didn't answer. I had no idea who this man was, but I didn't want to find out. Something about the way he spoke, his tone, made my blood run cold. I took a step forward, hoping to get a little more distance between us, but he matched my step, his footsteps growing closer. "Don't be scared," he said, his voice soft but eerie. "I'm not going to hurt you." Something about his words made me feel worse. It was as if he was trying to comfort me, but all I could feel was the pressure building up in my chest. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. My feet moved faster than my brain, and before I even realized what I was doing, I started running. I sprinted down the street, my boots slipping on the icy pavement, but I kept going, not daring to look behind me. I didn't stop until I reached my house, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing, hands trembling. I pressed my back against the door and slid down to the floor, gasping for breath. I had never been that scared in my life. The man's voice still echoed in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been following me for longer than I had realized. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the lights on, the curtains drawn, and the door locked. Every little sound made my heart skip a beat. The wind howling outside, the creaks of the old house settling, each one felt like a warning, a sign that something was lurking just outside, waiting. The next morning, I woke up early, too shaken to rest. I walked over to the window and peered outside, expecting to see the man standing there, watching me. But there was nothing. Just the usual stillness of the snowy landscape, the empty road stretching out before me. But as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. Just beyond the streetlight, where I had seen the man the night before, there were fresh footprints in the snow. They were deep, large, as if someone had been standing there for a long time. I felt a sudden surge of fear. I never saw the man again, but every time I walk home after dark, I feel that same icy chill creeping up my spine. The memory of his voice still haunts me. There's no explanation for what happened that night. Maybe he was just someone lost in the storm, or maybe he was something else entirely. But I'll never forget that feeling, the way my skin crawled when I realized I wasn't alone. And now, every time February rolls around, the cold doesn't feel quite so comforting anymore. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The winter of February 2018 was the kind of cold that could steal the breath from your lungs. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you feel like you'd never be warm again. I remember it vividly because it was the last time I ever went back to my grandfather's old hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It had been years since I had visited. After my grandfather passed, the cabin had been left to my father, who never really used it. He wasn't much of an outdoorsman, and after a while, it became my responsibility to check on it a couple of times a year, making sure no animals had gotten inside, that the roof hadn't caved in under the weight of the snow. That February, I had a few days off from work, and I figured I'd take a short trip up there, make sure everything was still standing. I wasn't planning to stay more than one night, just enough time to take a look around and maybe enjoy the silence of the woods for an evening. The drive up was uneventful. Long stretches of empty highway, the occasional frozen lake passing by, and eventually the roads turned to dirt, covered in ice and packed down snow. The last stretch was the worst, a narrow path barely wide enough for my truck, lined by towering evergreens that blocked out the weak afternoon sun. When I arrived, the cabin looked the same as it always had. A single-story structure, modest in size, with a wraparound porch and a chimney poking out of the roof. Snow had piled up against the sides, but everything else looked intact. No broken windows, no signs of animals getting inside. I parked my truck and grabbed my bag, making my way up the creaky wooden steps. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees, and the temperature had started to drop. A storm was coming. I could feel it in the air. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and old wood. It was cold, but nothing a good fire wouldn't fix. I got to work immediately, loading up the wood stove and lighting the kindling. Soon, the fire was crackling, the warmth spreading through the single-room space. I unpacked my things, checked my phone, no service, of course, and settled into the old rocking chair my grandfather used to sit in. The silence was peaceful at first. Just the wind outside, the occasional creak of the cabin settling, the steady ticking of the old wall clock. But as the evening wore on, that silence started to feel wrong. Around 9 p.m., I heard something outside, a soft crunching, like footsteps in the snow. I sat up, listening. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer wandering too close. Then I heard it again. Crunch, crunch, slow, deliberate. Not an animal. I moved to the window, careful to keep out of sight. The porch light illuminated the snow-covered ground, but I didn't see anything, just the trees swaying in the wind. Still, the feeling of being watched crawled over me like icy fingers. I grabbed my flashlight and, against my better judgment, opened the door. The cold hit me immediately, stinging my face. I shone the light across the yard, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. Just an empty, snow-covered landscape. I was about to step back inside when something caught my eye. Footprints, leading from the tree line straight to my front porch. But there were no footprints leading away. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. I backed inside, locking the door behind me. Maybe it had been the wind playing tricks on me. Maybe I had made those prints earlier without realizing it. I tried to shake it off, but sleep didn't come easy that night. I kept waking up, convinced I was hearing something just outside the cabin. The wind howling, the creak of the porch, and once, a soft, deliberate knock at the door. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting. It didn't happen again. By morning, the storm had rolled in. Heavy snow had already covered most of the ground, and the sky was a dull slate gray. I decided to leave as soon as possible, not wanting to risk getting stranded. But when I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. The footprints were back, fresh ones, leading from the tree line to the front porch, still no tracks leading away. I scanned the woods, my breath coming out in rapid puffs. There was nothing out there, just trees and snow. But I knew I wasn't alone. I threw my bag in the truck, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I wasted no time backing down the narrow driveway, my tires slipping on the icy path. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was a figure, tall, motionless, watching me leave. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I drove straight home, my heart hammering the entire way. I never went back to that cabin. I never told anyone what happened. But sometimes on cold February nights when the wind is howling outside my window, I swear I can hear it. A soft, deliberate knock at my door. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The winter of February 2017 was the coldest I'd ever experienced. I was living in a small rural town in Maine, renting an old house on the outskirts where the roads stretched long and lonely and the snow swallowed everything in sight. I had moved there after a rough breakup, thinking the quiet would be good for me. I had no neighbors for miles, just miles of dense woods in every direction. It was peaceful. At least, that's what I thought. I had a routine. Every morning, I'd shovel the path from my house to the road, start my old truck, and make the slow drive into town for work. After my shift at the hardware store, I'd stop at the same gas station, grab a coffee, and drive back home before the sun went down. Winter nights in Maine were long, and once the snowstorms started rolling in, the world felt even more isolated. I didn't mind the isolation at first, but by mid-February, something about it started to feel wrong. It started small. One night I woke up to a strange sound outside, a soft crunching like footsteps in the snow. Half asleep, I convinced myself it was just an animal and went back to bed. But the next morning, I found footprints in my yard. They weren't mine, and they weren't leading away. They stopped right outside my bedroom window. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. My first thought was that maybe it was a hunter or a lost hiker, but why would they be wandering around at night? And why would they stop at my window? I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just some kid playing a prank. But the next night, it happened again. This time I was awake when I heard it. That same slow, deliberate crunching outside. I turned off my bedroom light and crept to the window. The snow reflected the moonlight, giving everything a ghostly glow, and then I saw it. A figure standing at the tree line. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but I could see the dark outline of a person, just standing there, watching. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just stood there, staring back, waiting for them to do something. But they never did. After what felt like hours, I finally backed away from the window and grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed the police. By the time an officer arrived, the figure was gone. The only proof I had were the fresh footprints in the snow, leading from the woods straight to my house. The officer walked around, shining his flashlight into the trees, but found nothing. Probably just some drifter, he said. Maybe someone looking for a warm place to sleep. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But deep down, I knew better. The next few days, nothing happened. No footprints, no sounds in the night. I started to think maybe whoever it was had moved on. Then, on February 17th, the power went out. A blizzard had rolled in, covering everything in white. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows and making the whole house creak. I had a generator, but it wasn't strong enough to heat the entire house, so I stuck to the living room, huddled by the fireplace. That was the night the knocking started. It was around midnight when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic knock at the front door. Knock. Knock. I froze. Knock. Knock. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly moved toward the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Who's there?" I called out. Silence. I inched closer and peered through the peephole. Nothing. Just snow and darkness. I stood there for a long time, listening. The wind howled, the house groaned, but there was no sign of movement outside. Finally, I turned the lock and stepped back. That's when the knocking started again. But this time, it wasn't at the front door. It was at the back. A cold wave of fear washed over me. My back door led to the woods. There were no footprints on that side of the house. Whoever it was had circled around without making a sound. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then I heard it. A whisper. "Let me in." It was so quiet, barely more than the wind, but I knew it was real. I grabbed my shotgun from the mantel and stood in the center of the room, waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, gripping that gun with white-knuckled hands. But eventually the knocking stopped. I didn't sleep that night. The storm finally let up the next morning. As soon as the sun came up, I went outside, gun in hand. The footprints were back. They circled my entire house. But something was wrong. There was only one set of prints. No prints leading to the house. No prints leading away. Just the same set, looping over and over, like whoever had been out there had been walking in circles all night. That was enough for me. I packed a bag, got in my truck, and drove straight into town. I rented a motel room and didn't go back for 2 days. When I finally worked up the nerve to return, the footprints were gone. The snow had covered them. I moved out at the end of the month. I never figured out who or what had been outside my house. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear it, a whisper barely more than the wind. Let me in. Story the end.